It's almost dark. May 2nd, 1863. A tangle of scrubby woods in Virginia they called the Wilderness, near a lonely crossroads named Chancellorsville. A small knot of horsemen picks its way down a dirt road, out past the front line, into the gloom. At the center rides a lean, bearded man in a dingy coat and a faded cap. He doesn't look like much. He is the most feared soldier in the Confederate Army. He has just pulled off the most brilliant attack of his entire life, and now, restless, hungry to finish the enemy off before morning, he's riding out into the dark to find the road for a night assault. Behind him, his own men crouch in the black woods, nerves stretched to breaking, listening. They hear hoofbeats coming from the direction of the enemy. A shout. A nervous finger finds a trigger, and the southern line explodes, a volley fired by Confederate soldiers straight into their own general. 3 bullets hit him. 2 shatter his left arm. In a single instant, at the very peak of his greatest victory, the South has shot off its own right arm. His name was Thomas Jackson. The world knew him as Stonewall, and the slow, strange death that followed may have cost the Confederacy the war. This is the story of the fall of Stonewall Jackson. To understand why one bullet mattered so much, one friendly bullet, you have to understand the man it hit. Because by the spring of 1863, Jackson wasn't just a general. He was a legend, a weapon, something the South had come to believe was almost unbeatable. And he was, frankly, one of the strangest men ever to wear a uniform. Before the war, he was a professor at the Virginia Military Institute, and a bad one. Stiff, awkward, humorless. Cadets mocked him behind his back as Tom Fool Jackson. He was a hypochondriac who sucked on lemons and sometimes rode into battle with one arm held straight up in the air, convinced it balanced the blood in his body. A man so devout, he tried never to fight on a Sunday and prayed over nearly every decision. Silent, secretive. He kept his battle plans even from his own officers. He was, by every account, an odd, rigid, difficult man. And then the war came, and turned the awkward professor into something terrifying. It started at the first big battle of the war at Bull Run in 1861. As the Confederate line buckled and men began to run, Jackson's brigade simply would not break. They stood, and another officer, trying to rally his own panicking troops, threw out his arm and shouted that there was Jackson, standing like a stone wall. The name stuck, and it became the truth. Over the next 2 years, Stonewall Jackson became the hammer of the Confederate Army. In the Shenandoah Valley, he marched his men so far, so fast, that they earned a nickname of their own, the Foot Cavalry. He appeared where no one expected him, struck before anyone was ready, and ran circles around Union armies several times his size. And he found his perfect partner in Robert E. Lee. Lee was the mind, the patient, daring strategist. Jackson was the fist. Lee would conceive the impossible plan, and Jackson would go execute it, marching through the night to slam into the enemy's flank at dawn. Together, they had made an outnumbered, outgunned army nearly unstoppable. Which brings us back to those woods, to Chancellorsville, to the masterpiece. In the spring of 1863, Lee's army was cornered and badly outnumbered, facing a Union force nearly twice its size. By every rule of war, Lee should have retreated. Instead, he did something that should have been suicidal. He split his smaller army in two, and he handed Jackson 28,000 men and a wild idea. March them in secret, all day, 12 miles around the entire Union army, and hit it where it least expected, from the side. It worked perfectly. At dusk on May 2nd, Jackson's men came screaming out of the thick woods onto the unguarded Union flank. Whole regiments were caught cooking dinner. The Union line didn't fight. It folded. Men and wagons and panic rolling backward in the dark. It was, by any measure, one of the most brilliant attacks ever fought on American soil. And it wasn't enough for Jackson. He wanted more. He wanted to cut the enemy off from the river, finish them completely, end it that night. So in the falling dark, he rode out ahead of his own lines to scout the road. And his own men, jumpy and blind in the black woods, heard horses coming back from the enemy's direction, and fired. He was carried off the field in the confusion, at one point dropped from the stretcher onto the ground. By the time they got him to the surgeons, he'd lost a terrible amount of blood. That night, the doctor, Hunter McGuire, took off his shattered left arm. When the news reached Robert E. Lee, the man who had directed armies without flinching, broke down. "He has lost his left arm," Lee said, "but I have lost my right." And later, aching, "Could I have directed events, I would have chosen, for the good of the country, to be disabled in your stead." At first, it seemed Jackson would live. The amputation went well. He was moved away from the front to a quiet plantation office at G.I. Haney Station to recover. He was alert, talking, expected to pull through. And then pneumonia set in. For days he faded in and out, his wife at his bedside, his fevered mind drifting back to the battlefield. He called out orders to officers who weren't there. "Order A.P. Hill to prepare for action." And then, on May 10th, 1863, the storm in his mind seemed to pass. He grew calm, and his last words were not a command, but something gentle, almost peaceful, a man finally laying the war down. "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." He was 39 years old. The greatest partnership the Confederate Army ever produced was over, broken not by the enemy, but by a tragic accident in the dark, fired by his own side. Now, we should be careful here, because it's easy to turn Jackson into a pure, tragic hero, and the truth is more complicated than that. Yes, he was brilliant, fearless, devoted. He was also a slaveholder, and all of that genius was poured into the service of a cause whose foundation was human bondage. Both things are true at once. And in a way, that is the tragedy of Stonewall Jackson and of the whole Confederacy in a single man. Extraordinary gifts spent on a terrible cause. But strip it down to cold military reality, and the loss was staggering. Because just 2 months after Jackson died, Lee marched his army north into Pennsylvania toward a small town called Gettysburg. And he went there without his right arm. We can never know what Jackson would have done at Gettysburg. History doesn't run the experiment twice. But on the first day of that battle, the Confederates had a fleeting chance to seize the high ground that decided everything, and the order to take it, if practicable, was left to a more cautious general, who hesitated. It is one of the great, unanswerable questions of the war. And many Southerners, for the rest of their lives, were sure of the answer. If Jackson had lived, those hills would have been taken, and the war might have ended differently. The South had lost its hammer. Lee had lost his right arm. And the high tide of the Confederacy was about to come crashing down on those hills above Gettysburg. Next time, from the Southern perspective, we'll follow Lee's army north on the greatest gamble of the war, to the 3 bloody days that broke the Confederacy's back, and the doomed, magnificent charge that marked the furthest the Southern dream would ever reach.